can.
Is
I'm
this
recording
better
now.
Here.
Yeah, wherever it was good. Then we're kind of calibrated on the audio levels. Cool, man. So we'll figure out, if we need to do any post editing, but hopefully we can just kind of post the raw video and just,
Yeah.
let's record, like you said, like 10 of these before we actually publish anything, because there's no rush until you start publishing stuff. And then it's like, people are like, where's the content, dude? Like, you got to kind of put it out at a regular basis once you start posting it.
Right.
So, so what did you want to talk about in the podcast today?
Well, I think we should just start with a little bit of a recap of the conversation we were having before in terms of just sort of where the idea is now in its own development.
Mm-hmm.
And then we could go from there.
Sounds good. You want to start?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I think it is important to highlight this idea is still in development. It's cool that we were both thinking about starting a podcast and that we've come up with this sort of platform as a way to create a podcast in a way that at least I've never seen one be created before in terms of the infrastructure for how guests are going to be on the show and the opportunity to have sort of a network of hosts.
Yeah. So do you want to give like a overview of like, I guess like a short summary of like what the concept is at this point, which is obviously still going to be still under development, but.
Right. Yeah. We keep mentioning this word development. So the title that we have now for the podcast is the Millennial Development. And it's really targeted. Our target audience or user is millennials who are into the work of our own development, both personally and professionally. And I think that takes the shape of like physical development, mental development, emotional and spiritual development. And so in terms of the format of the podcast and the structure for how we've set this up, I'm honestly really excited about this. It's sort of like blockchain meets a podcast meets what I would call like a later stage organization, or like we're going to use the advice process, which comes from a book I read called Reinventing Organizations. But anyway, so to get more into it, the idea is right now there's two hosts for this show, you and me, and we're going to start by recording some podcasts together on different topics in sort of the realm I was mentioning. And then we'll have either one of us can have guests on our show as long as we go to the other person and ask for advice about that episode of the podcast and get input on what questions will be good and topics, and sort of use that as a way to iterate before the podcast itself is shot. So that's our format for getting guests. And then to take it one step further, there's another permission, which is actually adding other people who can be hosts on the podcast. And to do that, it requires unanimous consent from all current hosts. So the first host we want to add, you and I both have to fully agree that that's okay. And then that person can do the same thing, have other guests on the podcast as long as they go through the advice process with you and me, and also recommend other hosts as long as they're unanimously approved by all existing hosts.
Right. So it ends up being an open source podcast in a sense where it's, there's no one person owning the podcast. There's this collective that keeps growing. And in that way, gets an opportunity for people to kind of host a couple episodes of a podcast without going through the process of filming 20, 30 episodes that it usually takes to get something off the ground. Right. And then, you at the same time, you can film just 3 episodes and then get, exposure through this bigger network of people who are also doing podcasting. So it's kind of sharing the equity in the idea, but also sharing in the growth. So you get leverage through the network. So it's a very cool idea that you came up with for this podcast. And I, as far as I know, I haven't heard of anyone doing anything like this. So it's pretty cool.
Yeah, I'm honestly really excited, especially with the network that we can tap to build the podcast as guests and potential hosts, just
Absolutely.
From both our personal networks. And then I really do like thinking about the network effect, like the network of people And then there's also the network of ideas. And there's also a network of like truth and consciousness. Like I see a lot of, like we all have unique perspectives, right? So a lot of us have a way of seeing things that's true and also partial. And so as more and more episodes are recorded, we can have more integrated and whole and encompassing truths because more and more perspectives can be added on a topic.
Right, exactly. Because you know, you can have a one-on-one interview like you're talking about. We can then kind of like have another interview where that kind of cross references, and another one that cross references, and that way we're not like having a podcast with 30 people trying to talk over each other at the same time, but we have a kind of sequential, like 30 different episodes that can continue to build on some of the same ideas that kind of naturally emerge, where it's like we don't even know what the main things we're going to be talking about in the podcast are, but we'll naturally have some things that probably keep coming up again and again, and then you get 30 different perspectives on that idea in a one-on-one format.
Right. How cool.
It's pretty sweet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know, I mean, just for, I think some of our mutual interests are technology, entrepreneurship, health and wellness. I think we're also into, you know, leadership, and just like big ideas in terms of what's the future going to look like and what are the most important things for 20 something and 30 something year olds to be thinking about right now.
Yeah.
You know, as we orient ourselves for the rest of our lives, really, we don't have that much time on earth. So like, how can we, how do we want to leave it when we're not here anymore? I think that's a question a lot of us are in at our age right now.
Yeah. And it's almost like a blessing and a curse of our generation is that we have almost like infinite opportunities. Whereas I think previous generations, you know, had more of like, oh, like, you know, I'm going to go into one of these. I mean, if you go back like a couple hundred years, right? It's like, oh, I was going to be either a factory worker or a farmer, or you had like 10 options. And then you do that, you did a good job at it. And you kind of look back at your life and you're like, well, you know, I picked a job, I did a good job at it. And, you know, I'm happy with my choices. And now we have like an infinite set of choices that we could be doing. And we could really be kind of limitless in our career path and our life path, which is both a blessing and a curse because you both have all this opportunity, but then you can have, right, like kind of like the curse of choices where you have this regret of like, oh, but I could have been doing this, or why didn't I do this? Or like, you know, you're kind of like looking at your life in all these parallel universes and like, there's always some more optimal choice than what you made, right? You're not going to be in the perfect parallel universe out of every possible universe. And so, you know, it's like a lot of people, I think, you know, might end up getting hung up on that or kind of like in a smaller sense, just overwhelmed by the amount of choices that they have.
Yeah. And there are actually studies that show, like psychologically, if you go into an ice cream shop where there's 50 different ice cream flavors, that you're way less happy than if you go in and there are 3.
Yeah, exactly. Like you have in every facet of your life, you have all these choices, and people tend to think like, oh, more is better. Like more is always better, right? Like why would you want 2 choices when you can have any kind of choice you want? But you get kind of like, you know, stressed out, I guess, about making the right choice. And then you have more like buyer's remorse of like, oh, but I could have made a better choice, right? Like there used to only be 2 types of blue jeans and now there's like 5,000 types. And so you get into the store, you're like, what the fuck where do I even start in terms of like, right, what section do I even go into here? It's like, well, do you want like the skinny boot cut or the boot cut with the skinny, you know, begin? I'm like, I don't know, man. I just want a good pair of jeans. Like, I don't, you know, give me the best one. I don't want to make all of these choices. It's not like, you know, something I want to do. But yeah, I think there is a paradox of choice for sure. And at the same time, I don't want to sound negative. I'm very inspired by all the opportunities that we have in our generation and the fact that the internet has opened up almost limitless career paths. Right.
Yeah. I mean, it's really well said. I think there's truth to both perspectives and we want to honor both sides. Like the number of choices that we're faced with is overwhelming. And there's also another choice, which is I might not have to buy one of the 500,000 different pairs of jeans that are available. I could go make my own jeans. Right. So then it's like, then there's another choice of do I want to do that? And the cost benefits weighed there. So I think it's important to honor both, which is that like it's 2019. If you want to start your own gene company, you can do it. um,
Yeah.
but there's a choice in that. Like, is that how I want to spend my time? And so
And yeah, that gets to the point of like, right. I think something we were talked about a lot in a previous conversation as we're talking about starting this podcast is the idea of, you know, how do I spend my time is a great question.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah. And I think we could do an entire episode on choice and talk about opportunity costs and talk about,
absolutely.
you know, just the magnitude of these things. But I also want to address one other thing, which I kind of is underneath what we're talking about that I think is so important to bring awareness to, and a big reason why we're doing this podcast, which is I really sense that we're in this huge transition phase as a species, like individually and collectively. And we're really, you know, like you said, a couple hundred years ago, you would grow up and be like, okay, I'm going to be a blacksmith, or I'm going to be, you know, a farmer or whatever. And the potential to go your own way wasn't as easy. And now that we can go our own way, this question of like, okay, if I can create anything, what do I want to create, brings on this like daunting sort of personal work of like, okay, like what is my unique essence? Like what is my unique contribution and my unique gift that I can share?
Right.
You know, and then, and how, and what am I doing it for? What is all this for? Am I doing it for money or for fame, or am I doing it to serve other people? Am I doing it to, you know, how am I orienting myself? What's my true North Star? And I think that's something that everyone, well, not everyone, I think a lot of people our age are starting to be in that question. And so much of this, you know, we are the generation who grew up with Lewis Howes and Joe Rogan and Gary Vaynerchuk and all these people who are talking about success, and asking that question of what does success mean to me brings on like more than I think we bargained for.
Yeah. And that's exactly, it's, you know, we hold ourselves, as humans to really like high standards, I think, in terms of how we want to live our life. And then there's all these, I read this good blog post where they're talking about all the different kind of like tentacles of needs. It's different than the hierarchies of needs, but I guess it's kind of the same thing, but it's more like within, right? So there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is, I think, something that's kind of central to the way that we think about things. But in that highest tier of self-actualization, right? Or like that idea of like, you know, the basic needs are met, and then I have these choices of how do I want to lead a meaningful career. You kind of have these different tentacles pulling you towards more like money versus I need like, you know, to be like kind of your ego of being like, I want to be well known or recognized, versus like, I want to actually do really good things for the world, and kind of like, you know, my moral tentacle is kind of pulling on me of like, I don't want to just do something where I'm going to like be rich and famous. I want to do something that's like good for society and is going to leave behind, you know, a better world. And you have all of this stuff that's like, dude, like you can't get like everything all at once. You got to like move in the right direction of what you want, but it's like, it's hard, right? You're like holding yourself to like this impossible standard of like, all right, well, I got a great successful job, but now it's not moral enough, or now I have a moral job, but it's not, you know, not enough money, and whatever it is, like, you know, there's always good and bad, you know, trade-offs to every choice. And I think we can really like kind of hold ourselves to really like high standards in that sense. It's overwhelming. It's an overwhelming choice to make in a lot of ways.
It is. And there's this pressure to just like figure it all out right now.
Yeah, this is the time. Yeah, this is the time where it's like, okay, like I've built, you know, foundation of education and, you know, whatever else, you know, basic skills and stuff. And now it's really like, you know, you have a little bit of basic leverage behind you to the point where, you know, you kind of leverage your existing, you know, initial job and initial, education, and, you know, really just steer your path from here. You know, mid 20s to mid 30s is a really impactful time in terms of your career choices, right? So that's, the pressure is kind of on for people of our age. And yeah, it's overwhelming, but it's also, you know, just inspiring that like, if you find something that you are uniquely good at, right? Tiger growling in the back here. What's wrong, bud? You don't like that idea? He doesn't agree, man. But yeah, it's like if you find something that you're uniquely good at, the there's kind of like the job market will reward you for your kind of uniqueness or your own kind of what makes you uniquely you and what makes you like your personality, your creativity. There's no substitute for that, right? Like if you learn how to code really well, you can get a really good job that pays well, but then someone else from India or somewhere else around the world can then be constantly competing with you in terms of like there's all this everyone else is learning that same language and they're all learning, right? They'll undercut you on price and there's all this competition of like, you know, someone who can write good code, for instance. And you know, I do software development myself. And so that's, you know, something that I think about is like, you know, I don't want to be have my job be 100% specialized in something that is inevitably I'm competing with other people in versus if you are right, like if you're Joe Rogan, there's no other Joe Rogan out there. If Joe Rogan disappeared, there's no other guy that's like, well, I'm Joe Rogan now. Like, you know, Joe Rogan podcast continues. It wouldn't be the same. There is no other human being on earth that's Joe Rogan. And so he's built this brand behind him where people all know him and he's, you know, successful already. But not only that, but there's no real competition because even if other people come in and do the same kind of thing, inevitably there's going to be people that just like Joe for himself, for his personality, and will want to continue to listen to him for that. And so that's what's kind of inspiring is that, you know, the more that you kind of go through this journey of who am I and what am I really good at, what makes me different, what is my true personality and true self, the more that you figure that out, the more that you can leverage that in your career because that's right. That's like the thing. That's the one thing that no one else can compete with you on is your personality and your unique self. So it's cool.
Yeah, and that is, I mean, that's really well put. I agree with everything you said. And that uniqueness, our inner essence, is always transforming and evolving. And so it's really interesting too. Like as we live in a time where like life is iterating really fast, to bring in like kind of a software development startup term. Like things are evolving so quickly with technology, and you know we sit around and wonder, you know, when is it that that all these jobs, you know, we're gonna have driverless cars? When are we gonna have restaurants with no servers? You know, when are we gonna have? I mean, as soon as we have driverless cars, we'll quickly not have anybody working on the cars anymore because they'll just sort of pull themselves.
I mean, we already have those things, right? We have driverless cars. Every Tesla has an autopilot feature. A bunch of restaurants, you go into McDonald's now and you're ordering on a screen. It's just, the future is here. It's just not widely spread yet.
Yeah,
you know, it's not everywhere.
It's interesting where the pain points are too. Like, I don't know if you saw Elon Musk at that transportation conference in California, kind of yelling at the government, going like, hey, the cars can drive themselves, but there's no paint on the road, so they can't see where they're going. Like the thing holding us back is shitty infrastructure. It's not.
Oh, our infrastructure is horrible. Yeah.
Terrible.
Yeah. Things that we've known how to do since the Romans, which is building roads, like we can't do that. We got the whole like AI driving our own cars, which cars have only been around for, you know, since the 1880s or whatever. But yeah, the pain point is the roads, which is pretty ironic because it's in the hands of the government, right? And so that's things that are in the public's hands. If you had, you know, a private company that would introduce its own kind of, you know, moral hazard kind of like incentives issues about like, you know, incentives not being aligned with the public good. So that's its own problem. But, you know, you could just look at, you know, the pain points being often in things that are not from the private side, but from the more regulation side or infrastructure or whatever is coming from the government. Which there's good and bad. There's positives and negatives to that as well. Like I'm not personally someone I used to be more of like a complete, you know, laissez-faire, you know, libertarian kind of guy. And I've seen over time, you know, some strong examples to kind of, you know, counteract that. But in general, right, government will make things less efficient. but that doesn't mean, that we need to get rid of government completely, because often, incentives are in the wrong place. Kind of going on a political rant here now, but but yeah, it's interesting. Like to your point, it's basically like the things that are holding technology back aren't the things you would necessarily expect. It's not the first thing you think that it's like the tech or like the machine learning that's holding it back, and it's like, no, we're ready to go. Right. It's more like, something that you hadn't even thought of is like the pain point.
Well, and again, it brings in another question. So first of all, we should definitely do an episode to kind of talk laissez-faire and different political ways of organizing ourselves. I think it's really fun to deconstruct those, and then it's also really fun to kind of try and reconstruct what something in the future could look like, which I know we've talked about in some of our previous conversations. So
these are the kinds of political conversations that I enjoy, is like coming up with hypothetical alternative political solutions, right. Not like talking about, did you hear this guy and this guy had a fight and all the drama about the talking heads and the politicians.
Right.
Is
who cares?
Not, I can't, waste my time and my thinking with that kind of stuff. And it's all, and then all the negativity around, there's most political news is so negative, and it's just toxic to be putting all that negative information in your head all the time. It's, it's important to keep up on the big themes of what's happening, of course, but all the political drama is not for me. I like to, kind of get to more of the, if you were building your own society, how would you design a better political system? Because it's obviously super hard to do, and it's easier said than done. But like, what are the, what is an optimal solution? And then kind of like working backwards from there to see like, all right, well, how can we get 10% in that direction with a policy, for instance, or with a politician? Given the constraints of our system, how do we start from like what's optimal? What would be like, redefine kind of a, kind of creative solution to politics in some ways, that's not necessarily like a mainstream solution, but then kind of like work backwards and be like, how can we make a small step in that direction given the shitty system that we have?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's a big thing, is like, what can we do now? Like there's that bridge between where we want to be and where we are now. But I think that's a big intention for this podcast too, is we're going to have a bunch of millennial leaders who are sort of Renaissance thinkers and can bring different unique perspectives and contributions to these massive questions, like what is the future of money, or the future of government, or the future of exchange, or the future of transportation, or any of these things we're talking about. What does the healthcare system look like in the future?
Right.
And we can get these sort of integrated, encompassing truths and perspectives that have a lot of different people's perspectives in them. And I think so. That's the beauty of a podcast like this, is that we're going to be tackling some of those questions, because that's what the world needs the most right now, is not just, obviously, like, look, it's easy. If I would encourage anyone who's spending their time focused on political talking heads and what they're saying to just stop, like, just stop, like pick up The Wealth of Nations, or pick up like a book on physics, or start teaching yourself to program, or like get yourself prepared to be able to contribute to the new world and stop focusing on the old world.
It's short-term. It's a short-term focus, and it's not making people happy.
Right.
Exactly. How happy are people that are following political news and ranting on Facebook? They seem like they're really just upset all the time about, right? People getting emotionally aggravated over everything that, a politician will say. And it's like, you can't let your mental state be so affected by the state of the world. The world has a lot of problems, and the world has a lot of cool things out there. And, to allow, all the, drama and honestly shitty things that are happening, to let that consume you to a point where, you're not mentally healthy anymore. It's not a good practice. And it's what a lot of people do. It's not to say you shouldn't stay informed about honestly, the facts of what's happening. This meeting happened. This was the result. This is what the politician said. There was a big climate change conference. Trump said he didn't want to, Trump refused to acknowledge that climate change is real. That's an important, fact to know. It's well, that's fucking absurd, but I'm not going to get upset. I'm not, I don't like it. I'm not going to, let it consume me. But, But yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's
important.
interesting because
Yeah.
we want to honor, like, it's important for me to honor the feelings I have. So like I do get frustrated about the state of the world sometimes, and I want to honor that, but that doesn't mean I have to live in it. Like it comes
Exactly.
up for me, I honor the feeling, and then I go, okay, like now I'm gonna go about my day. Like I don't resist
Yeah.
it and say it's not there, and at the
Yeah.
same time I don't just make it my whole like
Mhm.
experience.
Yeah, exactly. It's not, you don't want to bury your head in the sand. It's just kind
Yeah,
of like, um, you don't need to absorb, have that be your primary focus of all of your, um, research or free time. But yeah, just kind of like keeping up on what's happening, and then just like, wow, registering like that is terrible. That's a problem that really needs to be fixed. And then just like not trying to separate the emotional side of it, and just kind of having a healthy emotional response to it is important too.
right, right.
We could get all into mental health and how meditation helps that kind of like separation of emotions versus like you're just to kind of separate that initial response, like that like snap instant response that you get emotionally, to kind of just take a space between, you read something and you are like, okay, my initial response is like, that pissed me off, but I can take a space away from that and be like, okay, I'm not going to let it piss me off. So you
Right.
kind of, take back control of your mental state. But there's a whole,
We got to do a whole podcast on that because
on mental health.
that's
Yeah.
on mental health, and I think mental meditation, that space
Yeah.
between. And I
Yeah.
think one of my favorite ways of framing that is when you have that space between stimulus and response, you can actually choose to respond instead of react. Um,
Hmm.
and I really like that because when you have the space, you have choice. Which
Yeah.
yeah, so we got several themes coming up for future
Oh,
episodes.
for sure. I mean, made a list of what, some of the biggest problems were in the world. And I think all the ones that I added to it were mental health problems, which I didn't even realize at first. I was like, oh, like loneliness,
Yeah,
isolation, um,
isolation,
just like,
mass acts of
yeah,
violence.
yeah, exactly. Like all of these things are mental health problems. And yeah, there's a whole, you know, we can really dive deep into that topic, I think.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things we wanted to do on this podcast as well is kind of give some recommendations. I want to make sure that, as we're pointing out problems, right? It's really easy to kind of just point at things and say, this is a
Yep.
problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. It's like, okay, great. What's the solution?
Yep.
Or what's some more positive, actionable advice that I can take, right? So it's like, okay, we talked about the fact that um, choices are overwhelming, and that even though you have, all this opportunity out there, we kind of, said, all right, well, there's a positive of like, you can kind of try to embrace your unique self. That's kind of a positive piece of advice. I think a book that we had both read that, really uh, was something that we both got a lot from was the one thing.
Yep.
Remind me of the author of that book. Do you know? We'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we'll
Um,
put it in the show notes. It's the real estate guys. Keller
yeah,
Williams, is that right?
that sounds right.
Okay.
We'll put it in the notes, but yeah, I think we want to make it a theme of, talking about books and resources and content outside of our own content that was inspiring to us. Right there, it is.
There it is. Gary Keller with Jay Papasan.
You had that on deck, man.
Yeah.
You had that in your back pocket. Just reach right in here. Matter of fact. Um, but but yeah, it's so I think something that we wanted to make a theme of the podcast is to continue to not only, put our own content out there, but kind of put pointers to content that's been foundational, really inspirational for us, in the way that we think about certain things. And so the one thing, um, I'll kind of try to give my own quick summary of the main idea of the book, and then could kind of add to that. But I think for me, it's really a book about how do I spend my time. And we had that question earlier. How do I spend my time? It's like time is the most valuable resource because it's scarcity is what drives value, right? And time is scarce by by definition, for our lives. And so time is probably the most valuable resource that we have, because we can always get leverage and get other, right. We can kind of like get a following of people behind us, or a bunch of capital behind us, or all these forms of leverage, technology, all these things to really, bring ourselves up to be way more than ourselves. But we can't do anything to get more time other than, I guess, good health. So that's part of the importance of good health, is quality of life, but length of life as well. But yeah, time is obviously probably the most valuable thing that we have. And so the book tries to, I think, answer that question of how do I spend my time? And it's really a lot of big ideas. It's not a lot of specifics. It's really a framework of thinking. I think it does a really good job of framing up how to set priorities, which is really what the question is. How do I answer my time? There's 100 things you could be doing at any one point in time, right? So prioritization is the key task, is the key skill that you need to be able to decide, how do I spend my time? Because otherwise you get overwhelmed and you end up doing something that wasn't worth your time. And so he has some really good advice about how to prioritize things and how to spend your time and how to, set your vision of what you're working towards. And I'll kind of let you add on to that. And what did you kind of get from the book?
Yeah, the biggest takeaway, I believe I forget exactly how they frame. We could do a whole podcast on priorities, but I think they frame the main subject of the book as like, what's the one thing you can do that will either eliminate everything else or make it much easier to do. It's not exactly the language, but which gets to priorities. And for me, that requires a lot of constant check-ins. Like, at least once a day of me writing down my to-do list, and then I put in order what my priorities are. It requires, even in the middle of the day, I'll do that again because things come up, and I find myself getting tied off in doing 4 or 5 things that at the end of the day I realized didn't matter that much.
It's really easy. You're in such a high stimulus environment at work where you're just like getting emails and people are talking to you. It's like, oh, Tommy, is this done? Is this done? And especially when you're trying to manage other people's time as well. And so it's really easy to just kind of like something pops up in your ear and you just start working on it because you're just like, oh, well, it's the thing that I currently am thinking about. So why not just like get it done? Right. It's like this mentality of just like a doer's mentality, which in some ways is great. You need to embrace the positives of that. Right. There's 2 ways to waste your time. One is to just do things and not think about what you're doing and just not be doing the right things, which is a big waste of your time. The other way to waste time is to sit around all day talking about what you should be doing and not actually do anything. And so just thinking like, oh, it's not good enough yet. We haven't thought about every part of it. Right. And so like, those are the 2 kind of sides of the spectrum. And I don't know if I could say which one is better or worse, but you don't want to be on either end of that spectrum. You want to be once you know what your priorities are, you want to have a strong bias towards action and really be like impatient with getting things done. But first, you need to know that the things that you're doing are the most important things that you could possibly be doing. And it's not an easy thing to decide, and it's subjective, but just getting into a habit, like you said, every day or twice a day or whatever it is, getting into a habit of just pausing and instead of just hearing something and then just doing it, being like, okay, let me get into a habit of like naturally before I start any task that's going to take me at least say half an hour. Do I need to be doing this right now? Right. If it takes 5 minutes, just do it, whatever. But if you're about to be investing half an hour of time or telling someone to invest hours of their time, right, before you make that decision, just kind of like a quick check-in, just be like, is this important? And is it the most important thing that I could be doing or that this person can be doing? And it's just like a habit, I think.
Yeah, I want to circle this back because I know you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs earlier, but it's really interesting to look at this from a developmental theory perspective because there's a stage in developmental theory called achiever or self-determining, and that's like, let's just get shit done. That's really the essence of that stage, and that's
just do it.
Right, just do it. Yeah, and it's like, we've got I think 35% of the world making meaning in that stage, most of the world's leadership. And then there's the next stage, which is the self-questioning stage, which is literally like, let's sit around for 9 hours and talk about every possible scenario and explore, like turn over every rock. Like
that's me. I tend to lean more actually in that direction than the doers mentality, where like I've, in certain businesses that I've done or whatever, I'm just like, oh, but like we haven't thought about like, what if this and then this and then this, but then what if this, but then what if this? And it's just like, dude, you can't sit around all day not doing anything.
Well, and I think it's important to note that is a vertical development. So like that is actually an evolution. Like, okay, so first of all, something really important to talk about in this podcast is that human beings can evolve, and there are actually stages of meaning making and development we can evolve through. And I'm excited.
Let's do like right now, in case our listeners haven't like heard much about it, let's try to do like a 2-minute overview of what is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Do you want to try to tackle that?
Yeah. So Maslow is a developmental psychologist. He's not my go-to in terms of developmental theories, but his theory, he has a pyramid, if anyone's ever seen it. And essentially it's stages of development human beings can move through, starting at our most primal foundational needs. So we have like food, shelter, what are a couple other ones, like air, oxygen, right? Like water. These are basic, like I cannot survive without my primal animal needs, right? And so then once those needs are met, or at least mostly met, we can move into the next stage, which is about some sort of connection with other people. I'm doing this off the top of my head, so if I'm getting this wrong, feel free to jump in.
I'm Googling it currently.
Okay,
Keep going.
Cool. Yeah, so the next one is about some sort of connection with other people. And then we feel the following that, there's one in terms of self-esteem. So actually feeling some sense of like, okay, I'm worth something. I have some value. And then I believe love is after that.
And I totally put you on the spot with that question.
No, it's all right. This is the one I'm least familiar with, but so if I'm getting any of it wrong, go for it. But yeah, it's like survival needs, connection, self-esteem, love, and then at the top is self-actualization, which is what we've been talking about. An interesting thing to talk about with Maslow, and actually when we talk about some of the other mental theories, I can in later podcasts we can address this. But Maslow's deathbed actually said that self-actualization wasn't the highest stage, that self-transcendence was. And I think that would be interesting to explore in the future. I wouldn't want to do it right now, but I would want to note that there are stages available to human beings past self-actualization, but little, if any, of the population is making meaning from there. And the ones who are like sitting in caves in Tibet for the most part. Although there are some walking around. There are some walking around in the American workforce, believe it or not. So anyway, so it's dude. Right. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so it's cool it's really important for this podcast that we bring up that human beings can evolve. And so just to loop back to what I was saying, that with the self-determining achiever, that's, and then the self-questioning one where we need to kind of, where you said you feel like you're more in that system of needing to explore every scenario and get all the opinions and think about all the use cases and everything. That's actually a stage of vertical development in meaning making. And then the interesting thing that we're hinting to is the actual next stage, which is the self-actualization stage. It's also often commonly called strategist, or this, because the strategist stage, at the strategist stage, we actually come up with systems. So like we're talking about, it's like, okay, I'm going to have a system. I mean, you did it just a minute ago.
I'm all about systems, man. That's my thing. I love systems.
Right. If tasks are going to take more than 30 minutes, I'm not going to do it without running it through my algorithm, which is writing it down and prioritizing it and then determining if that's what I'm going to do right now or not. So that is another vertical development from self-questioning, which is like, it needs to go through my algorithm. It needs to go through my system.
That's pretty interesting because I had never heard of that, but I think I just naturally have developed into a systems thinker, and myself and the CTO of our company are both definitely very much systems thinkers, but it's like this meta systems thing too, where it's like, what's the system of generating systems kind of like thinking, where it's just like, even in your own process of work, how do you organize your own thoughts so that you can create systems so that they can create other systems, right? There's just like, systems are what enables anything to be either automated or scaled optimally. Like if you don't have a system, then you're just kind of in chaos. And that's like, it's, you know, the only way to really, you know, kind of talk about chaos theory, right, is the physics concept that like the world naturally tends towards chaos, right? Or the idea that like you look at your room and it will just naturally get messy unless you clean it, right? It's like it just, the state of the world just naturally tends towards disorder. And I think the only way to avoid that in work or your personal life or anything is to generate some kind of system, to then the world's not, you know, then it's not running through the natural chaos of the world, but instead it's running through your system, which is get enforced.
So cool, like, to think about. So one thing we haven't said is you and I both are working in startups right now. And I think that's important because you and I both work in startups.
We did not do a background of.
Yeah, we just jumped right in. But, whatever. I mean, yeah, we both lead roles in startups with sort of
hold on just a minute. Your audio is coming in bad for me. Are you still able to hear me well? Are you able to hear yourself well?
I can hear you. A connection was unstable for a second. Is it better now?
Still a little bad. Try it again. Just let's see.
Yeah. See if is it getting any better?
Definitely. Yeah. It kind of got like robot voice for a second, and we'll see if that came through in the recording. That'll be interesting to see if that was just something where I was hearing it that way live or it got recorded that way.
It actually came up on my screen and said your connection's unstable.
Okay. It's probably coming from your end because I've definitely like a good quality internet connection going on over here.
Cool. But
I don't know how good your internet strength is.
All right.
We can get into that more, but I'll just interrupt you if the audio is ever bad.
Perfect. Yeah.
But let's do like a short intro. You can start.
Yeah. So we lost connection for a second, but just to check back in. So we're doing an intro real quick. Tommy and I both work in startups, and I think it's interesting the unique place we're in because we both have a business mind and an engineering mind. And I think that's really cool to be cool in the startup environment to merge those two perspectives. So me personally right now, I'm working at a fintech startup in Boulder, Colorado. That's where I'm coming from today, from my home in Boulder. The company's called Arrived, and we are a point of sale and payment processing system for breweries, cideries, wineries, distilleries. And it's a really cool company. Mostly all our leadership came from Google Payments. They built Google Wallet. So we've got a Google culture, Google, it's a very Google environment, I guess I'll say. And there's a lot written about Google work culture. So I'll just table that for now. But it's cool to see how that's integrated into the interview process and the work culture and work environment, everything. My job title is growth strategist. It's a sales position. But I would argue it's a lot more than that because I can see, I'm working with breweries, for example, who haven't even launched yet. They're opening up in 3 months, and I'm bringing I've been an entrepreneur. I've been an entrepreneur for years now, to help come problems that they haven't even anticipated yet. So we usually a point of sale in a company is especially in the restaurant business or in a brewery, is sort of in the way. It's kind of a hindrance in the entire business model. And with what we've built, it's like a service enabled product that really helps these businesses provide the best service possible, which is so important at a brewery or a winery. I mean, people want to interact with someone and ask questions and learn about the history of the brewery and things like that. So yeah, I'm asking people questions that they haven't anticipated yet and helping support them in the launch of their business is really where I find the most meaning in my work. Obviously, getting them teed up in our point of sale system and empowering them to to be able to provide the best service possible is a huge part of the job. And we really do consider ourselves partners as they launch their business. So, I mean, going back to the systems thing. It's like, hey, what kind of systems are you going to have? I did today's Saturday. So yesterday I sat down with one of our technical leads and learned about how wireless networks get established inside of breweries and what happens when a wall is in the way, or what happens when a metal, when a vat or something, a bar is in the way of a connection, and just being able to anticipate these things in terms of helping people as they get things set up, and how that's going to affect not only the business end, but also a customer if they want to jump on Wi-Fi. So anyway, that's my check-in in terms of what I'm currently doing. At some point, maybe I'll talk about previous projects, but I'll kick it over to you and you can talk about what you're currently up to.
Yeah, thanks, man. I think that, I think we should do an entire, thing on, just our intro, and, kind of get more in depth on our background and, that we've worked together in the past, for instance. So I'll just, for now, just kind of, again, talk about my current position. So I work for a very small startup called Lokiata. In Sanskrit, that means for the attainment of a better world. And so our mission is to alleviate global poverty through a data-driven approach. I am the lead data scientist, and there's 6 people at our company right now. We work in Africa and India, and what we do is we use data science and machine learning to find out how to give access to credit to people who have never previously had access to credit, traditionally by partnering with mobile networks, mobile wallet providers, even like different kind of tech companies. And anyone that really has data on customers, that's very non-traditional type of data. So nothing about what their salary or credit score is, but then we kind of build a credit score and help assist lenders to provide credit to people who have never been able to do so, and whose kind of best alternative option is to go to a payday lender, and with really high interest rates and kind of predatory practices. And outside of that, we're kind of expanding our product offerings to a lot of other machine learning driven stuff. And it's pretty exciting. I guess our credit scoring is the core of what we do, but we're looking at how we can add value to the entire kind of banking or telco business value chain just through machine learning and analytics. So I love my job, and it's definitely something where I can be very creative. And like you said, something that I look for in any job is definitely being able to be both in a business and engineering role, or like Naval says, learn to build, learn to sell, which we can get into more. But it's really about getting deep into the technical details, as well as going high level and how do we sell this, how do we strategize this, what do the customers really want. So definitely cool stuff that we can dive into more.
Cool
intro.
I think it's awesome what you're working on, man. And I know you're the perfect fit for that, but that's one of our items on our list of top world problems is global poverty, right? So I'm excited that
I'm blessed to found this position. It's really something where you could, kind of it's itching all my tentacles, like we were talking about. All of the moral and self-actualization, everything. It's very cool. But yeah, I think if we want to get into more of our background, or do we want to get into more of startups and just the challenge of startups and our experience more from that perspective of how do startups operate, because it's quite hard.
Oh yeah. I mean, as you said the other day, it might be the hardest thing to do, and I've been thinking about that a lot. That's been on my mind. I'm like, is there anything harder? Because it's definitely on there. It's definitely like top 5 if it's not number 1.
It's on the list of the hardest problems. Yeah, for sure. So we were
Yeah.
talking about how like the less defined a problem is, the harder it is to solve. The more open-ended, or the kind of the bigger the search space is across all of your solutions, right? The harder the problem is. And then also like the more narrow the kind of, so wide search space makes it harder, but also like a narrow solution space makes it harder as well, right? So you have this problem where you have a very undefined problem. You have a team of people that is working towards some kind of vision, but can kind of pivot at any point in time, depending on the market and the product market fit. You kind of don't even know really what, you're working towards one goal at one point in time, but that can always change. The way in which you do that, or the people that you hire, the order in which you do things there's so many choices you can make that it makes the search space really, really large. And, you don't have someone telling you this is the solution that we need. The market doesn't even know what solution it needs. You have to define the problem and then define the solution. And the solution, there's only going to be a couple solutions that actually work, because it's competitive as hell out there. And if it was easy, then someone else would have already done it, would already, taken away all of the opportunity, right? And so if it was easy to do, it would have already been done. And so there's only a couple solutions that will actually solve the many, many, many different ways that you could try to solve the many, many different problems. And the way in which you approach that problem is very, is such a wide search space of like, what do I prioritize among hiring versus investors versus funding versus building out the product versus getting customer feedback? How much do I listen to the customer? How much do I listen to my own intuition? And there's all of these choices you have to make. And it's something where you're kind of relying on, either a general framework of thinking, which I would advise is probably the better way to go. Build a really solid foundational framework in the way that you're thinking to make decisions, kind of like a system of thinking. Or you're relying on anecdotal evidence and listening to stories of other successful founders and them telling you this is what worked for me. But then what worked for them in that situation is not necessarily going to work for you in your situation. The situation is a little bit different. The timing's a little bit different, right? Like what worked for Airbnb 5 years ago, everyone's already been trying to take their mentality and apply it to the market. So it's no longer
Uber of X.
Yeah. So it's like, if Uber is like, all we did was just like make a smartphone app because we had a good idea. And then like, it just, we had to just build scale as fast as possible. It's like, all right, well, that worked for you. But now that there's a million people trying to do the Uber for X thing, like the next best thing might be to think, all right, well, a million people are trying to solve the kind of marketplace solution. What's the next problem that people haven't even thought of yet, right? So to be the next Uber, you can't just copy Uber. You have to kind of copy the framework and systems of thinking that Uber went through in their problem that they solved, and kind of apply your own unique kind of specific knowledge to that problem and your deep understanding of your own problem to that, right? So it's kind of like put yourself in Uber's shoes in 2005. Don't try to do what Uber's don't try to do today what Uber is doing today. Like, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And that's also from like the market perspective, because then we come back to the perspective of ourselves, right? Which is like, what is my unique gift and contribution that I want to make? So it's like, I mean, quite frankly, like there are a lot of business ideas I have that I could go do, but I just don't want to spend my time. Like realistically, I understand now, I didn't understand this when I first started getting involved in entrepreneurship, but realistically, if you are going to start a startup or get involved in an early stage of a startup, I would highly recommend, I think of it in terms of a 10-year commitment, like in terms of what actually needs to be accomplished and achieved. So like, yeah, we talk about prioritization, right? It's like, I got 50 ideas for businesses I could start, but I'm not going to spend 10 years working on that idea. I might spend 5 minutes thinking about it, but I might talk to you about it over a beer, but I'm not going to spend 10 years working on it, because I've only got one life to live. And then I've got like 3 or 4 major projects I can work on, and I'm just not going to spend it on, things that are not worth my time.
Yeah, so you can't build every idea that you have. I used to have the same kind of mentality where I was like, oh, like I just thought of like this amazing feature that Netflix doesn't have. And so
Exactly.
I could just build it, and then it would be better than Netflix. And it's just like, dude, you're not going to build it. And so I actually called Netflix with my product idea, and it was like such a funny conversation because this dude was
That's epic.
he was used to just handling like, yo, like my TV doesn't work, asshole, like, you know, like those kind of calls. And I'm just like, dude, like, can I give you like a product, like a feature recommendation?
Yeah.
He was like, what? I was like, yeah, like, you know, like, when you flip the channels on the television, you just have instant content, and you don't have to go through this whole overwhelming choice paradox of like, this overwhelming choice decision. What do I watch? Right. So people are overwhelmed by choices. We talked about that earlier today. So the same thing used to exist with Netflix, where like you get on there and you're just going through this catalog of like recommended stuff. There's just like, do I really want to just invest an hour and a half into this movie? Like, should I read the reviews? Like, and you're just going down this whole, like you're about to buy something on Amazon or whatever. You're going down the whole, but I don't like that flow. I like the idea of like, you change the channel, and I didn't even know that I wanted to watch basketball, but suddenly basketball's on. I'm like, oh, actually, this is pretty dope. Like, look,
Right.
that's Zion on the screen. That's dope. And I'm just going to watch it. Right. Or it's like, oh, I'm bored, I'm going to change the screen. And so I was like, I called Netflix and like gave them this idea of like a shuffle where it just shuffles you into like a random episode of a random show. And then you can just kind of flip through it and then be like, oh, this is pretty cool. I'll actually watch it. And so now they've started doing the thing where if you're not watching anything, they'll play the preview, which I think is a similar idea. You're kind of immediately immersed into the content. You're not just like sitting in a catalog having to make this final decision of which content do I want to watch, which makes sense in a case where you have to pay for content. But when all of it is already free, like, why are you like waiting so long to make a decision? So now I'll just flip something on Netflix while I'm looking for other stuff or whatever.
I appreciate your contribution to Netflix.
The dude had no idea how to respond. He was it's like, thank you, sir. Like, all right.
Yeah. That's awesome.
I don't know if that went anywhere. I don't know if that escalated to anything. But like, it was the idea of like 5 years ago, I would have like in college, I would have been like, yo, like we're going to build this. Like we're going to build, you know, I would get really hyped up about it for about, 3 hours and be like, yeah, like I could build this. It's way better than what Netflix does. But then it's like, a feature might differentiate you for like a couple days. And as soon as you get any amount of hype, then Netflix has a team of engineers that can just build that feature. So it's not like can't compete with them on their scale. You need scale to be Netflix. And I'm not going to invest that amount of time. And so why would I bother holding on to this idea instead of putting it out there? I hope Netflix, listen to that. Maybe I should send them an email or something. But,
and really to tie this back to, I mean, if anyone, so entrepreneurship is I wouldn't say entrepreneurship is really sexy right now, for a lack of a better word. Like everyone and their mother wants to be an entrepreneur, right? And I mean, there's a lot of reasons for that, right? We want to be our own boss. We don't want to have to work just from 9 to 5 because we're told. We want to be able to be more authentic in our work. We want to be able to bring more of ourselves to our work. We want to make more money, be able to utilize more leverage in our offerings. The world's just moving that way in general, from these big centralized sources of power to more decentralized things where everybody's an independent contractor. We can be a programmer and write and build websites for 3 different clients at one time, kind of thing. But all that being said, if someone is considering going into the work of being a contractor or consultant or an entrepreneur and starting a startup, like they're in all of this work, whether you're a videographer or starting a company or anything, there are days where you have to literally like drag yourself up off the ground. And like, if what I'm working on isn't inspiring enough for me, then I just can't do that. So like, if I'm not passionate enough about sharing movies and TV shows with people to go and compete with Netflix, I just need to drop that idea completely and submit a feature request, because I still want to use a feature, but it's not my startup. The startup is the thing. Really, what happens with a startup, like a really startup, honestly, this podcast is a perfect example. Like, this concept brewed inside me so long that it eventually just came out. Like, it almost couldn't help itself. I went to Asia last summer for 2 months. I was in Bali for a month and Thailand for a month. And the entire time I was traveling, I had this podcast microphone in my bag. And I didn't shoot any. I mean, I shot a couple podcasts, but that's how long this has been an intention of mine. And eventually it got to the point where it's like, I can't not do this. And I think that's one of the most important things you could possibly say if you're actually thinking about the work like I would really say you're sort of finding, I feel like I'm finding what I really want to do if I say something like, I can't not do this. Like if someone ever says that, pay attention.
Yeah, you should listen to yourself when you have that thought and follow that, right? It's like follow your instincts and that kind of stuff. It's funny because we kind of in the same week, we both had this idea of getting this podcast started. You filmed the first episode and I was like, researching mics and was like about to, start filming my own podcast. And it's funny. You had this, brewing for months, and I literally have been thinking about this for like 3 days. And I'm just like, why would I wait? Like, let's just fucking do it, dude. Let's go.
Right.
Like, let's do it. And this is, builder's mentality, but in the sense of like, I thought about it first and I was like, okay, I want to, get my ideas out there in the world. I think a lot of people would find this stuff valuable. I think it would be a good growth opportunity for myself in terms of, learning how to, talk and articulate these kind of more important things that I've been thinking about. And just, I think it would be a great learning opportunity. I think these are great conversations to have just in general. And then the fact that we're putting it out there, is only going to, be a positive thing for ourselves and for everyone else. And so, yeah, kind of went through the checklist of like, right, is this worth doing? It was like, yes, it is worth doing. And then it's like, let's just fucking do it then. At that point, like, just do it. So I got like duct tape to this microphone because I didn't want to wait to get a better microphone. But it was, that's what you got to do. But it's funny. I've certainly been in the same place where I've just sat on ideas for a long time of things that I wanted to do. And there's still things like that where I've just, have felt like I haven't had time to do them. And I've been, thinking a lot more recently about how to prioritize time and realizing that, I do have time to do them. I just don't have time to be doing other things that I'm doing, which are not high value. Right. Like chores and errands and stuff like that. Like I just need to be spending less time doing that and more time doing this, like these things that I've been brewing. Like I really want to do a podcast. I really want to build a machine learning algorithm to trade stocks. Like I really want to do this stuff. Right. And like, whatever it is, like that's the stuff that you should be prioritizing and spending time doing if you know that you really want to do it, versus like, I have to go return this thing because if I don't return it, then in 5 days, I don't get my $30 back. And it's like, in the end of the day, what thing was more important to be doing, right? There's an urgency versus a priority, right? Priority is not dependent on urgency. You can't just, because there's some kind of deadline on something, you just prioritize it. Because it's like, oh, well, if I don't do it in 5 days, I lose the money, got to do it. Like urgency. But it's like, errands don't need to be urgent. You can just choose to not, you're always your own person and you can choose to just not do things. So, urgency shouldn't be the driving factor.
Yeah. And it's amazing too. I mean, just bringing this back to developmental theory, it's amazing what that shift embodied feels like from the self-questioning stage where we have to sit around and like explore every perspective. And we still bring the best parts of that, right? Like that's part of moving to self-actualization is we bring all the best parts of previous stages. So it's not like that goes away.
Yeah.
But like I so feel it in my body and I so sense it in you of like there's just like this thing with time. It's like, we gotta fucking go. It's gotta happen. Like, let's go. Like right now. Like we can't like it's almost like where we just were drives us insane now. Like it's like we can't sit around for 10 hours and explore every perspective and talk about every
exactly.
Thing.
There is an urgency.
Been there, but like we gotta go now. Like right now. Like
the urgency is in your time. Your time is so limited. Yeah. So there is a natural urgency of like, well, if you wait 3 months to start doing the podcast, like that's far too long to wait, right? So there is this urgency, but it's driven by your own set of priorities that create the urgency. It's not driven by some artificial deadline or timeline or some arbitrary, urgency. It's really, you do feel this sense of immense urgency with the things that you need to get done, which I definitely feel the same way. I feel like almost like, in a panic sprint at times of like, I need to get to this stage where either this thing is done at my work, right? This system is built at my work, or, this thing is this podcast thing is done. It's kind of like this sprint towards that. And then kind of like you did it, you kind of like, go back, kind of collect yourself, look at what you just did, rest for a minute, kind of like evaluate and then iterate and do it again. And you're kind of doing these like short, like sprints.
It's a sprint.
That's why
it's going to be
the name
so
came
fun.
across. Yeah.
Right. It's going to be so fun to integrate all the things we learned from working in tech into like work, like the work and life perspective. I mean, they're so closely related. And actually, you know, the working on Dormy together, our previous project, which we'll talk about some other time. There was a lot of things that I learned just from, that was my first big experience to a technical project from a database perspective, and you know, servers and front ends. And I learned a lot about my life just based on like creating a schema, for example, and how much I use that, but like that mentality in my day-to-day way to prioritize things. But yeah, we'll table that for another time. I want to loop back to kind of what you were saying about feeling the urgency and like I got to do this now, because in that sprint, I sometimes it feels like a wave to me, and it's like you gotta ride the wave, like the wave's here and now. Otherwise the wave like passed. So interesting. Like, so I traveled around the world with this microphone, and I recorded some stuff, but it always felt like I was missing the wave. And I mean, I know why that happened. It's because the format for the podcast hadn't taken form yet. So I know now, like the other night we got on the phone, and it's so funny how things happen when they're really meant to happen, because I'm intending to connect for like 10 minutes to talk about a potential consulting job, right? And then all of a sudden 2.5 hours later, we're on the phone and going, why didn't we record this conversation?
Yeah, we were both just like blown that we didn't record it. We were like, no, dude, that was the first episode.
Everything was done. Yeah, that would have been the perfect first episode. And then it's like, okay, the wave's here, like start paddling.
Yeah.
And like, it's so important to realize that. Yeah, it's so important to realize that, because it's like the wave is something outside of ourselves, and it's important to sense into when things are happening. And at the same time, we gotta know. So it's like, and I think, you know, I mean, I'm really sensed into that now. So when I get on the phone with you and I'm intending to talk to you about this thing, and all of a sudden something unintended happens, and we basically have a podcast episode that's not recorded, I'm going, man, I'm not having any more of these conversations. I'm not going to get on the phone for another 2 hours with Tommy and not record it. Because people, like, when we both said things like, I wish my 16-year-old self could have heard this conversation. It's like, okay, we got to get this recorded. And then, you know, just laughing about how you have a podcast mic that's going to be there on Monday, but you were able to figure out a way to take one of your music microphones and tape it to a rod so we could get going with an MVP this weekend. It's like, let's just go. Like, let's go.
No blockers, man.
No blockers. Like, and so I so appreciate that, of just like the time is now. I mean, we were talking about shooting this with just the laptop microphone. Like, it's like, let's do what we got to do. Like,
right. It would be better than not doing it, even though, got to do the best thing you can do in the moment, but it would have been better than not doing it.
And we could find a million ways to put it off, you know, but the wave's here right now. So like, get on the wave.
You can always create a blocker is, so for people who aren't familiar with the terminology, like a blocker is like a term in tech companies, or, you know, typically used to mean like there's something blocking my work. So for instance, you know, I can't continue writing code until, you know, someone else reviews my code. So that's blocking me from doing my work, right? So it's a blocker. And so understanding blockers is really important in terms of project management. It's, you know, really kind of like blockers become very high priority because you have something that's blocking the work. It's kind of like that needs to get done. I'm blocking someone else's work. Someone else is blocking my work. That should kind of be one of your first priorities. But I think that, you know, I've in the past had the tendency to use excuses as blockers. And so what I was calling a blocker for myself about, let's say, you know, the podcast mic isn't here. You could call it a blocker. You can call it an excuse, because really what it is there, you can always find some reason not to do something, right? You can always find an excuse not to do something, whether you call it a blocker or an excuse. You know, there's always something that's not quite right. It's not quite perfect. And, you know, you got to be able to just again, you know, doer's mentality after you've set the priority, right? You already know based on a number of reasons that this is really important. We'll get more into how to set those priorities in another podcast, but you at a point where you know it's high priority. at that point you need to do it. You need to just do it, and you should feel a sense of urgency to act, to be impatient with stuff getting done that needs to get done.
There tends to be a level of discomfort that comes with those things. I don't know why that is, but like, I don't know if you've noticed, it's like, I'll put my list together and then I put the top priority at the top and I'm like, like, is that really the one? Like, I mean, it's not like that every time, but there's some quote about like eating the frog or do the first thing you don't want to do every day. But it's funny how often that actually, I think the reason that's a quote is more actually because that tends to be the priority. And I don't know why that is.
Because it's hard. Because like, I think a lot of times the most important thing is also the hardest thing, or just not the most interesting thing. So, it's not when you're when you're talking about your own personal life, right? The most important thing often can be whatever you feel most compelled to be doing, right? Like that. But when you're in an organization, a lot of times the most important thing for the organization to be doing might be setting up some system for something really boring. But that it's important. It's really important to build a system, because if you don't build it, it's going to waste thousands of hours of time later, right? So you're like, I know how important this is. I know it's the most important thing to be doing, but it sucks. So on Friday, we spent like 4 hours talking about naming convention of variables, because it was the most important thing we had to do, and it sucked, but it was important.
And God, that sounds terrible.
It was like, how are we doing the suffixes of the variable? So we have to map potential in the future. If we scale to 50 clients, we have to be able to map all 50 clients to a common data model in order for us to really truly scale. Because then everything we built for one customer will work for another customer, and it's just a subset of the thing we've already built. And so it's super, super crucial to our entire really strategy of our entire scaling strategy that we have a common data model. And the only way for common data model to work is if the variable names will work across 50 different situations for 50 different customers, right? So it's clearly important, but it's also clearly not the first thing that I wanted to be doing.
Right.
But that's not always going to line up in a company. And when your personal life, I think it's more often that the most important thing that you can be doing is because you feel compelled to do it, like the podcast, right?
Yeah.
There's definitely a difference between what do I want to do the most versus what needs to get done. And again, I think we need to pretty soon here, dive into more of the wisdom of the one thing, and how we can get some good advice of how to set priorities, because we've already talked about how important it is, but we haven't really talked about some of the gems of wisdom that we've kind of gotten in terms of how to make that decision.
Yeah, let's definitely make that like a whole episode, because I'm actually coming up with my own model. I combine the one thing with something from our programming world that could be its own book. So I would want to explore that at the end of that podcast too. That'd be really fun.
Totally.
But yeah, and I think another thing that's coming up for me thinking about it is like, another reason it's not always fun is because it's change, right? Like, okay, this podcast, honestly, like I'm having a lot of fun. We're talking, but then at some point, like I got to go find, maybe it's an audio engineer to edit it, or I got to sit down and edit it. And then I got to look up, how to get the audio on SoundCloud and tie that RSS feed into Apple Podcasts. I mean, obviously I've already done some of this, but like eventually one of those things, whether it's creating a logo or building a website to host this or reaching out to somebody or whatever it is not going to be fun. Mm-hmm. And I think part of that is because like fun, I guess, I mean, from the perspective of just, maybe the most fun thing for me is to just sit down and record podcasts. And so I just want to sit down and do that over and over again. But then like, okay, they're not going to get published anywhere if we don't sit down and edit the audio or something.
And eventually if you have, I think if you end up in a place of true financial freedom, in the sense where let's say you have $10 million, I think you're kind of at that point where, like, think about Elon Musk. He only does what he wants to do all the time. Like he has this big vision, of each of his companies, or this massive big vision, really, really hard problems to solve that are so hard that people just thought they were impossible to solve. And he, even though he's the CEO of these companies, he doesn't do finance stuff. He finds someone that he trusts to do the finance stuff. He just goes around solving technical problems for the most part, because that's what he likes to do, or, going and talking about it. And so I think once you've built, once you have financial freedom, and once you have leverage, and you have, all this kind of power because of that, you really have the opportunity to only do the things that you want to do. And I think until then, you're right. Like, for instance, we can't afford to hire someone to do all the stuff that we don't want to do for this podcast because it would be worth our time to just do it ourselves. But if we, had an infinite amount of money, we could just record the podcast and pass it off to someone else to do all the engineering and get it up and do the logo and do everything. Right.
And actually there's some people, I've seen a lot of entrepreneurs who say, like, looking back, they didn't realize how much they could have outsourced at an earlier stage.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's something we could even challenge ourselves on moving forward is like, okay, like, what is our assumption or is our story that we need to do this ourselves actually true?
Well, that's of course one of the most important questions you have to keep asking yourself. It's part of the system of setting priorities. Is also
exactly. It's part of our system.
One of those, it really is one of my thoughts is as I'm doing any task, it's like, one, is this important? But two, do I need to do it? Can I delegate it to someone else in the US team? Can I delegate it to someone in the India team, or can we write a piece of code to automate it? Right. All of those thoughts go down my head as quickly as possible anytime that I'm looking at a task. And maybe we do it one way for now, but then very quickly we're like, all right, well, the next to-do list is to automate it because it's automatable, right? So anything that is automatable will be automated in an optimal solution. And then anything that can be outsourced will be outsourced in an optimal solution. And that what makes something automatable or outsourceable is one of the main things is the extent to which it can be done independently. So if you can write something like the extent to which it can be done independently and the extent to which you can build it to spec basically, right? So like if you want someone to build a new feature for your code, it's going to be hard to just outsource that. Outsourcing and automation are similar ideas, right? So it's going to be hard to like outsource something where they have to really learn your whole code base in order to optimally write the right feature, right? Because there's so many design decisions that are dependent on, it's all integrated with your existing problem versus you don't have a website, you want someone to build you a website, you know exactly how you want it to look. Perfect example of like, I'm just going to pay someone out in Malaysia to do this because as long as they can do high quality work, it's completely outsourceable because it's a completely independent task. We don't have any existing website. The website doesn't affect any of our existing work. So it's completely separable. So it's completely outsourceable. And then, eventually, right? I mean, maybe today it's not automatable, right? But in the future, right, we're moving towards a state of website creation being more and more automated, where if you have specs of this is what I want my website to look like, right? You already don't have to write code to build a website, but we're getting to a point where you can just kind of like, pop up a template and Squarespace is essentially automating the work that would have taken months for web developers in the 90s to be able to build something way shittier, right? So it's like anything that, can be, is independent can be outsourced. Anything that can be outsourced can eventually be automated, I think is the mantra.
I love it. Yeah, Wix has an AI now where you go through and you choose, I think there's like 10 different inputs, like this is a fashion company, I'm going to serve, we're going to have a newsletter, there's going to be an e-commerce store, there's no retail location, it's only online, like whatever, and then it just builds a whole website. And then you can go in and make the last little tweaks.
Right. And as long as you're okay with the template, right? If you're really particular and you're like, no, that banner needs to be a little bigger, right? Then you screw up. You can't use the template and then you got to have something custom. But like, as long as you are cool with compromising on, some templating, then you can pretty much just outsource it or just automate it. Right. I think that you get to a point where you have financial freedom and leverage and you really can spend all of your time. That's really, I think, what the definition of Naval says the definition of retiring is, not that you just go to a beach somewhere and just like drink margaritas all day. Because personally, that's not my definition of retiring. I have way too active of a mind and
stresses me out actually.
Yeah. If I take more than like a week of doing nothing, I get like really, I just start craving, like I need to read something. I need to learn something. Right. I need to like just challenge myself intellectually in some way or else I'm not happy. And I realized that when I lived in Argentina for 6 months. And the idea was that I was going to be working very little part-time and just mostly just kind of relaxing and not doing too much. And after a couple of weeks, I was like, I need to like do shit. I need to like learn, right? I went through this whole like path of really teaching myself how to do app development because I was just bored. And so my definition of retiring is definitely not sitting on a beach and just drinking margaritas, right? I mean, I'm totally about doing that for a couple of days. I'm totally about, right, like taking a day off and doing nothing. That's fine. But, the idea of years of doing nothing is hell to me. That sounds terrible.
Dude, I can hardly last a couple of days. I mean, I actually start to get noticeable anxiety. I mean, there was one night I had New Year's in Charleston, South Carolina a few years ago. And I left a bar and started running down the street because I was having like a panic attack. I was like, I can't just sit here and like do nothing. Like we're just doing nothing. Like it'd been like 3 or 4 days of doing nothing. And I just freaked out. I was like, I can't, like, I got to go on a run. And I just like left the bar and went on a run. I was like, I kind of exercise. And then the next day it's like, I went home that night and I read for 3 hours and I'm like journaling and taking notes. And like, I have all this potential inside me and creativity and things. And if all that just gets bottled up and I'm just like sitting at a bar and drinking and I'm like, what the effing whatever are we doing? Like I actually will have a panic attack. So for me, time, it's like a mental health thing. Like if a vacation to me is an antiquated concept.
Well, to me, I mean, vacation is however you define it, right? So I love active vacations. I love going on vacation and hiking a mountain or pushing myself physically, having some kind of new experience, right? Traveling through a new city, walking all day, meeting people, talking to people. I love active vacations. And I love, you can factor in a day to just chill, whatever, right? Spa day or something. But like my optimal vacation is not to just sit around. I get the same, I think I have the same condition that you have. I start to get anxiety about it. I don't know what we should coin that term. Yeah, we should coin that term. Yeah, exactly. I'm a very high energy person. I like to, go to concerts and dance and jump around and stuff. And I like,
I did that last night.
It's fun. It's fun.
Do you know Gareth Emery?
No.
It's an Australian DJ. I saw him last night in Denver and we were dancing pretty hard. It was fun.
Right on, man. Right on. But yeah, it's it's I think personality thing or just a natural state of having high energy. And just really, I get one of the best highs that I could get is from going down like an intellectual binge and just being like, wow, this is really like changing the way I'm thinking about things, or like, this is just a whole lot of knowledge I didn't have before. And it's really cool. But I think so. Naval is a investor who's has a podcast. He's kind of influenced a lot of our thinking on some of this stuff, but his definition of retirement isn't, sitting on a beach drinking margaritas or he doesn't try to define it too specifically either. It's more just like he has a really concise definition, which is that retirement is the point in which you no longer have to ever do something that you don't want to do.
Yeah. I love that.
You have complete freedom because financial, right? I mean, money's, superficial money shit is not going to make you happy, right? Like, everyone knows whatever luxury goods you're going to, buy a private jet or whatever, it's going to make you happy for like a month and then you're just going to get over it.
We've all experienced that. Yeah.
Yeah. That initial like, oh, I'm making money for the first time. And then you kind of like, you upgrade your lifestyle and then you just get used to your lifestyle. And then it's like no longer that exciting anymore. So, I mean, I think most wise people know that money on that kind of a superficial level is definitely not going to buy you any kind of happiness. But what it does buy you is inevitably just complete freedom of how you want to spend your time. And so if you never work, even at my job, as much as I love my job, right, there's days where I have to do stuff that I don't want to do. If you're in a state where you have complete financial freedom, that in Naval's sense, you're then retired and you no longer have to ever spend any of your time doing anything you don't want to do. I think it's a good definition because then it's
get there soon.
And it's right. Yeah. As soon as possible. So then that leaves it open to everyone's own subjective definition of how they want to spend their time. Right. So for us, maybe that doesn't look like sitting around and doing nothing, but for someone else it does, right? Maybe what I really want to do is lay around doing nothing. That, right? Retirement means you have the ability to do that.
Yep.
That's the definition of retirement. And yeah, I think it's something to definitely strive for. And I think a lot of people, are trading all of this. They're basically, leading like a lot of people will spend their entire career doing something that they're miserable at, or at least, in a smaller sense, just don't like. Right. And trading that for money, and eventually this idea that in the future you have a lot of money and security and I don't think that it has to be that kind of a trade-off. I think that you can love what you're doing as you're getting to the stage of retirement. You're just going to inevitably have part of your day spent doing something you don't want to do, but you're still going to be feeling energized and fulfilled by what you're doing. And the more that you feel that, the more likely you are to be successful, because if you're going to spend your time doing something you hate, you will never be the best at it, because someone else that loves it will be better at it naturally because they obsess over it. They love it. Right. And so you can never be the best at something that you hate. You can't even be great at something that you don't like. Right. So you're more likely to actually get to a state of financial freedom and retirement earlier if you're doing something that you truly love as much as possible along the way. So I think that's kind of a, do what you love in so many words. But
yeah, I think we should almost come up with a new word for that, retirement, because I want to talk about this. I want to reference this on future podcasts without having to break down our whole concept of what retirement is. But another thing I'll say too is, like, right, so we were talking about these different stages of Maslow's thing and earlier, and the most basic is our basic needs, right? Like food and shelter and stuff that requires money. So we do need money, like to provide for our basic needs, and we can't be our most creative selves and tackle the big problems in the world when we don't have food and we're worried about where our water's coming from, right? So like we need enough money to take care of our primal needs, and there's a false sense of security in thinking we can work an entire career and invest for retirement and then just retire. I mean, look what happened. Like, I think part of the reason that our generation is going through this like huge reorientation in life is because of the 2008 financial crisis. And we saw all of these people older than us who had worked their entire lives lose everything.
Yeah, it's like if I made all these sacrifices for financial security and then I lost all of it, right? What was it all for, right? I did
something I hated my entire life, so that one day I could quit it and not do anything. And then everything that I had saved for is gone.
Right.
I mean, that was like, I mean, what was I, 18 years old? But at that point, I'm going, holy crap, I'm in this model where people said, go to school, get good grades, go to college, get a job, work up the ladder, retire. And I mean, of course, I had always known I wanted to be an entrepreneur, but like that was the story I was told. Yeah. And we all knew it was BS anyway. I mean, we all knew that. Like, but that was part of the thing that
made it really real. Yeah.
Like don't. Like, that was your intuition, but the door wasn't knocking loud enough. Now it's knocking louder. Like,
I think in the end, you're making all these compromises for some security, and that's not guaranteed. Right.
Right.
So why bother it at all? Don't make the compromise for something that you think is going to be paying well, that you think is going to be secure. Right. People might be working really hard at a job because it's currently pays a lot of money, and make all these compromises and, choose to do this thing that they hate because it's currently paying a lot of money. And then 10 years from now is entirely automated, or 3 years from now is entirely automated. And, there is no guarantee in life. There's no one's giving you a guarantee. And so don't compromise on something in exchange for a false guarantee. That's, some kind of probabilistic, like maybe it's probably going to be there, but you never know anyway. So don't waste your.
What in the world is the world going to look like 50 years from now?
No one knows. It's so unpredictable. It's only increasing and changing every year. Yeah, it's exponentially changing the pace of technology, the pace of change is exponentially shifting. And so it's not only is it changing, not only is the pace of that increasing, but the slope of that increase is increasing, right?
Exactly.
It's like three derivatives up or whatever.
Yeah, I mean it is. And
right.
like, so it's like, the idea that, I mean, we don't even know. I mean, we talked about this the other night, but we don't even know if we'll have US dollars when we retire. So like, I'm going to go save all these US dollars to retire, like in an IRA. And like, I do this. So I'm not saying don't do it. Like I have a Roth IRA, like I have a 401k. It's not that I'm not doing that, but it's like, I'm not stopping there. Like that's a box I check and just keep going. That's almost like the bare bones. It's more like I just do that because I don't know.
Right.
Like,
yeah. I mean, it's your best option right now. But again, there's no guarantee, right? Yeah. There's no guarantee that, the entire U.S. economy or global economy won't collapse, right? But it's not worth getting anxiety over all of these potential things that are out of your control. But it's just the idea that you don't know what's going to happen. You got to get comfortable with that idea that there is no guarantee. The future is not like the past. And not only is that true, but it's more true now than it's ever been before. And you have to get comfortable with, it makes a lot of people really uncomfortable because it's, if you have the personality of someone that, really likes stability and predictability, it's an uncomfortable thought to think that like, we don't know where this future is going, but it's the truth. So I think I'm lucky that I actually get kind of energized by that idea and try to capitalize on it. But regardless of whether it inspires you or scares you, it's the reality is that it is an uncertain future. The world is uncertain. The world is more uncertain than everyone thinks that it is. And especially with extreme rare events that have never happened before. I'm just summarizing the Black Swan, by the way. Nassim Taleb, shout out to, this is probably my favorite book, Nassim Taleb, The Black Swan. I'm basically summarizing his thoughts here. I should try to designate what are my own thoughts versus something that is directly coming from another source. But yeah, this is Nassim Taleb's Black Swan is the idea that that the future is changing at an increasing rate, and that the world is uncertain, and that people always underestimate the really extreme rare events that at the time seem impossible because they've never happened before. But right, like whatever it is. I guess like it wouldn't really be the 2008 crisis because the Great Depression had already happened. But let's say the Great Depression at the time was entirely unpredictable, right? You could say that, no one could have predicted because nothing like that had ever happened. But at the same time, right, it has to happen for the first time at some point. And so, right, rare events will continue to happen, which have never happened before. And people tend to look back at history and use that as a guide. And it's a good place to start, but history does repeat itself, but in different ways and in more extreme ways, right? And different things that weren't even right before the internet. A lot of extreme rare events weren't even possible to have happened, and so that's still relatively new. So there's something that we can't even conceive of that is just that could be so destabilizing or whatever. That could be a cause of the internet plus, a number of other factors, financial crisis coming in with a World War III and the internet to get right. There's just like these things that like have never been possible before that could create really like improbable or unpredictable kind of random outcomes. And so basically just to summarize, the Black Swan principle is that a Black Swan is an extreme rare event. And his book talks about how to capitalize on extreme rare events financially and kind of how to plan your life around them. And the thesis of the book is that the world is much less predictable than people perceive it to be.
Yeah, that's one I haven't read, but I've heard quite a bit about it from especially my friends who are in data. It seems to be a popular book in the data world.
It's an analytical book, but he talks about it the same way that we're talking about it.
I own it. I just haven't read it. I think I have it here, so it's moving up my priority list in terms of next reads. There's an acronym I really like that's VUCA, which is volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And I think that really is a great acronym to talk about the world we're moving into. And if we can embrace that, the VUCA, right, the that the world's becoming increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous.
Mhm.
Like that is a move we need to make in our individual and collective mindset. And not only that, not only in our individual and collective internal, but also in the way that we organize our external institutions to be more fluid, to be able to move with all the change and to be able to handle increasing levels of complexity. That's a big, I mean, that's something I hope we explore on this podcast as we continue to talk about new solutions in the future, because right now, a lot of the, I would call them breakdowns that are happening around the world, or the rigid structures of old can't handle this increasing volatility or uncertainty or complexity that we live in now. And again, I think part of the reason that this podcast is going to be so helpful for millennials is because we're living in a world where we are so sensed into how much it's increasing in complexity and ambiguity. And it's a little frustrating to look around at all the current institutions. I mean, I can't imagine being in high school right now. I'd be like, give me a break. Like, you know what I mean?
Everything I'm learning is useless. Like, honestly,
well, and the whole format of it. I mean, the whole structure of the Industrial Revolution, that the high school is a factory to produce the lowest common denominator of a student. And then you're kind of just punted out into the world and said, oh, figure it out. And then really, like when you do leave the education system, whether it's in high school or college or whatever, we face the world and we go, okay, I'm either going to just like go get a job and be a part of some other machine, right? Or like the challenge is we can actually create the new world and create our jobs. A lot of the jobs we want don't exist yet. Right. And that's like, we have to step up to that calling of like creating that job, creating that company, creating that change. So there's like a call to action there, right? And I'm hoping that we can be of support to people who are sensed into that, but may not be able to articulate it yet, and also provide these resources, like we've mentioned several books already. That's where I'm really hoping, because the hardest thing for me in this journey, I don't know about you, but the hardest thing for me over the past few years is feeling sort of alone in it. And I know when connecting guys like you and a lot of people in our mutual friend group and stuff, it's made me feel more at home, because at least we're all working on it together, like trying to figure it out. Like, I don't think we ever like have it figured out, but like at least there are like words of wisdom and tidbits and things we can share with each other, and resources and practices and algorithms we run, habits, like, so anyway,
it's definitely not necessarily something that is on everyone's mind about, how much the world is truly changing. I think people that naturally embrace change more might be more tuned into it, and people that naturally reject change more might be kind of blocking that thought, or kind of some confirmation bias of only kind of looking at the not really accepting that idea that the world is changing rapidly, because if it scares you, it might be hard for you to come to terms with it, right? And for me, right. it produces some amount of anxiety, but it more overpoweringly is inspiring and inspiration and motivating. But yeah, like you said, like the systems of today are set up from the Industrial Revolution. A lot of the ways of our frames of thinking were from that era and not the internet era. I would say that's the next era, is after the Industrial Revolution, is the internet era. And a lot of our, systems have not adopted to that. Political, educational systems, financial health systems, all these systems that have been built over a long period of time and take a long time to change, still haven't really caught up with the reality of today's world. And one thing that scares me is that it seems that government will respond to, right, the state of the world, but I feel like it tends to do so in a linear way. At least the pace of change seems to be kind of linear, and the pace for government policy and the pace of change of technology is extremely nonlinear. And I feel like we're only getting a further divide between our current system and the reality of the world, right? So for instance, there's all this regulation about, taxis that is still just now catching up with Uber. And it's like, how long did that take versus how long has Uber actually been around being unregulated, right? And that's kind of a harmless example, but something, kind of more scary is the idea of artificial intelligence, really dangerous artificial intelligence, and people, one, making policy that don't understand it fundamentally. So the policy is inappropriate for the task because people don't have the technical knowledge to understand the right policy to make. But two, that the rate of change of that policy actually getting implemented or getting even discussed or being even on people's political agenda is not only not keeping up with the rate of technology, but it's becoming a bigger and bigger disparity where the rate of change is linear for government and non-linear for technology. So the gap is only increasing. And that, brings about interesting notions of what the future might look like. And, are we getting into more of a chaotic state where, the government is intending to impose order on chaos? And are we approaching a more chaotic world because of that gap?
Yeah, very well said. And a few things. It's on our list of priorities, right? Like we've got our top world problems, and AI moral and ethics is on the list. So that's definitely going to be fun to explore and talk about in the future. But also, hopefully, we can sort of make an impact towards some of these issues by bringing awareness to them, right? Like as more people listen and awareness spreads around these topics, hopefully we can make an impact in terms of like bringing this into the mainstream of, hey, maybe it's what we could be considering thinking about instead of like what got tweeted today.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first step is people aren't even talking about it, right?
Right.
People aren't even
brought into awareness.
Yeah. And some people are definitely talking about AI safety.
Yeah, but Silicon Valley and in the tech community, sure. Yeah, right.
Yeah, people that are exposed to it in some way, but it isn't one of the main priorities of the political agenda or even close to at this point. And I do follow news specific to AI safety and AI policy, and we're kind of at a point where all the nations are just starting to create an institution, right? They're just becoming aware of the problem now, or just becoming to a point where they actually are starting a group to think about it, right? Like the EU and US and different nations are hiring people to start thinking about AI safety, right? That's kind of where we're at versus like, the state of the technology is already, getting to a point where shit is pretty scary out there, where you got robots teaching themselves how to walk and teaching themselves how to run and play soccer, without any explicit programming, just, 42 parameters for each joint and repeated trial and error. They're just like, do I run like this? And they just naturally learn how to like run, and they just simulate.
Are hilarious.
Yeah, they all end up running like this. They're just like, apparently that's the optimal way to run. Like, I got to start trying that. For my dog, just flailing around, just screaming, just seeing what people do, just really stirring things up. But yeah, it's like you could simulate like thousands of years of or millions of years of evolution in a really short amount of time, because time becomes a function of your computing power. And so if you can just run all these simulations in a really fast amount of time, you're simulating thousands of years. Black Mirror kind of experimented with this idea in one of their episodes, which is a great show.
I haven't really seen it. I did do the Bangladesh or whatever it was called.
Which one is that?
It's the Black Mirror where you actually choose which
track. The choose your own adventure one. That was interesting in concept. It definitely wasn't one of the best episodes. Yeah. But it was an interesting concept. But yeah, there's one where this guy is torturing this person because they're torturing this AI that's inside of a simulation. And because they're just like, they're basically torturing them to talk they're like interrogating them. And instead of like, bringing out the pliers or whatever, they're just like putting them in like, 1,000 years, hit a button. And then they're just like, no, please don't do that again. Like they're just like in this like, blank wall for 1,000 years. Right. So it's really dark. The show is really dark, and there's, I'm both a pessimist and an optimist in terms of technology. So, but it certainly is on the dark side of what are the dangers of technology, and what are some of the, kind of things we should be thinking about. But yeah, that I'll link that episode as well.
Yeah, cool.
But yeah, I guess we should try to start to wrap things up,
Yeah,
and
for
talk
sure.
about like what are, I don't know, summarize anything we need to, or
Yeah, I mean, well, so my biggest takeaways are we should do an episode. I've got a lot of episode ideas. That would be my biggest takeaway. I think one on choice would be really good. One on priorities. Do one with an introduction. I guess the introduction would be the next one. And then we can put it before this one, maybe.
yeah. Well, we could. Yeah, we don't have to record it next, but we should release it first, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, one on choice, one on priorities. One on the political system. I mean, there were so many ideas that when I rewatch this, I'm going to probably take down 10 episode ideas.
It's going to be really cool to rewatch this, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
It's been great.
Yeah,
this worked really well.
Really fun.
Let's just assume that we can cut this part out now. This has been sick, dude. This has been really good.
Dude, I also think it's so funny how you were like, I don't think we should go Joe Rogan, and we just totally went Joe Rogan.
Yeah, I was like, I don't think we should just rant and like not pick a topic, and then we just did that. I was thinking about it, and
pretty awesome though.
Yeah, I was thinking about it today, and I was like, I know I'd said that it's better user experience to be able to like gravitate towards the topics that they're interested in and have shorter episodes, but at least at first, it's going to be really hard for us to come up with as good of a content by forcing that. I think continuing to do a kind of open format at first is really good, because this works so well. This just flowed perfectly. And if at some point we realize that we have enough top content on one topic, for instance, we could start the next one on setting priorities or whatever. But then if it naturally starts going towards politics or whatever, I don't think we got to like rein it in. I think we can just let it go and see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, it's like in alignment with our conversation today, it really goes back to like, we don't need to try and be like anybody else. Like the thing that's going to make this podcast grow is us being us. So like, whatever, if we want to do a book and a beer thing where we like sit down and I'm like, okay, like I was at this craft brewery today, like in Boulder, and like, here's the beer, and then you've got another one, and we like introduce our beers and we introduce a book and we talk about that. It's like, okay, like again, that's something nobody else is doing. Like
that's pretty cool, man. I love beer. Although I am I initially was kind of like in college, I would be like, oh yeah, I want to like do all these flights and try like all these different types of beer, and then I just kind of like realized that like 95% of what I want is an IPA. I just love IPA.
Same, dude. So my business card says it says Forrest Wilson, growth strategist, arrived, and then it says IPAs for days.
That's awesome, man. That's an awesome business card.
Oh shit. Yeah, I love IPAs. But yeah, it'd be cool if we could figure out a way to get the same beer and do like a beer review, or I guess we could each review our own beers, but that could be a really cool thing. And
yeah,
maybe
for sure.
Dude, I mean, that maybe Arrived would throw us some money for doing something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I definitely think, in the future as well, having that opportunity to review stuff, like, have it beers be sending us beer for us to review or whatever. It's just a cool idea, right? Like free beer in exchange for us giving our commentary on it. I do think that that's my one palate that I actually trust to talk about. I enjoy wine, and different types of wine, but I don't know enough to talk about it. I don't have enough of a palate to talk about it.
So you'll have to be you're the beer expert. I'll be the wine expert.
Yeah, I just haven't had enough practice with wine, I would say. I don't drink that much wine, but I like it, and I know basic idea of what I like, but wine goes real deep and has real complex, flavors.
Dude, it's a whole world.
Yeah, for sure. And it's for some reason it's a really pretentious world. I don't know why it's naturally become such a pretentious world. It doesn't have to be.
It doesn't have to.
But it is something that's just like, you can go real deep on it. But yeah, that would be cool. I really like that idea of booking a beer. we can come up with all kinds of different formats and start having episodes where if we want, we have a kind of a target of like, we want this to be 20 minutes. And we want it to be on this. But I think this went so well that I'd be happy to keep things open format for a little bit.
Yeah, I did start to get tired towards the end. So I think we should have some sort of cue for that. Like if one of us is starting to feel like we're not able to hold attention or something, we can sort of
take a pause or something. Yeah,
take a pause, or just like maybe signal like, hey, we should move towards wrapping this up. Like, I don't have another hour in me, kind of thing.
We should do a physical cue of like, just like a tap on my ear or something, or whatever it is, right? We'll pick a physical cue and we'll just do it that way. Because I don't want to interrupt the conversation, and it's better to do something like subtle and kind of physical.
Yeah, maybe we can
kind of like time to end it, dude. Episode's over, bro. That'd be pretty subtle, I think, actually.
The episode's over.
Just go full AI on it. And the AI have learned the optimal way, dude. We have to start mirroring them now.
It's like the AI thing in the fucking car dealership blimping, like.
Oh yeah, the inflatable balloon man. Yeah, I've had my dancing compared to that inflatable man.
Dude, I was dancing so fucking hard last night. I needed it. Whew. Stress release. That was so fun.
Yeah, man. About to be raging here tonight. We got a costume party going, and we're all about to roll in costume to a bar. And we'll be the only people in costume, but it'll be fun. Yeah, man. I'm hyped. But yeah, this is dope, man. I was worried that like when the recording was on, it was just going to be more inhibited in some way, but it really like wasn't. It was good. I feel like we were both very comfortable, and kind of the conversation still flowed the same way it did when we were talking on the phone. Like even though the cameras, mics are on. So that's a good sign. I think it's a really good sign.
Yeah. It's crazy to think about how like this is. I mean, I definitely like saw a lot of places I could critique it, and it could have been better. But like usually, it's like this whole concept of like push out an MVP that's like broken, but like we could argue like this was a trial run and blah blah blah. But like I thought the content was sick. Like,
I think what we'll end up doing is probably chopping it up into a couple segments where we can release them as separate episodes. And there's probably parts of it that we won't release, but I'd say 90% of it is releasable.
right.
The only part that I would actually say is not releasable is really the only part is if there's any audio quality issues. I don't think like we got so off topic or said anything inappropriate that we need to cut out. I think the only thing is like there's times where I'm not sure that the quality was good. We'll have to go back and check, but literally all of it I think is pretty much releasable. We just want to, I think, cut it down into like chop it up later rather than like enforcing it in the beginning and saying this is what it has to be about. Kind of just see where it goes, and then just take the 10 minutes that was on education and be like education, right? And then take the 10 minutes that was on startups and be like startups, and just give people more pointers to navigate the content. But it doesn't mean that we have to record it in that way. We can just structure it later. I think it's probably going to be the easier on us. It's less work for us. It's more free in terms of the way that we arrive at things, instead of forcing like we're going to talk about this. I think that's a good way to start it. At least like this MVP worked the way we did it, so why not run it back in a similar way?
Yeah, and we whatchamacallit, we're gonna shoot like 10 of these before we release them. So by the time, I mean, who knows where it'll be by then?
Yeah, exactly. We could go deeper on a whole lot of other stuff. I think we did a pretty good overview. This is pretty similar to the conversation that we had before, but a little bit more kind of ordered. We never went off topic really or ranted too much. It kind of all naturally flowed, even more than the conversation on the phone.
I think we should dive deep into something next and go ahead and pick it so we can like bring some points and stuff to it.
Yeah. And then your point of cross-referencing is going to be quite hard, actually. I mean, it's a great point and we need to figure it out. I think it's going to be difficult to say, like, at which level do we re-explain a concept and which level do we point them back to an earlier episode. And so at some point we're going to start, um, having new users that listen to the fifth episode suddenly not be able to understand what we're talking about because we're using a bunch of terms that we've predefined. So it's like allowing
Yeah,
people to listen to them non-linearly might be quite hard. Obviously, if they go through
maybe
in
that's
order.
part of our thing. It's like, hey, look, we're talking about these development things. Like, you need to, in order to truly understand this podcast, listen to the development of it. Like,
Yeah.
go start at zero.
The
And
what
like,
the harder thing is going to be stuff that we've defined ourselves. So stuff like we define Maslow's hierarchy of needs in this episode. We don't need to continue to redefine it. If you don't know what it is, you can Google it. But if it's like we came up with our own definition of retirement, meaning like, whatever we call it, like time retirement, and then we just keep saying time retirement, like what the hell is time retirement? And they don't know because it's something we made up and that they didn't listen to. So that's what we have to be more careful about is stuff where they can't cross-reference it themselves. They can only cross-reference it in our own content. And one thing that could help with that is I'm just thinking out loud right now is that we have a website. We're going to have a website, right?
exactly.
So the website can have like list of our terms, dictionary of things that
with a video to web us talking about it.
Yeah, just things that we've invented.
Yo, what about when one of our words gets in the fucking dictionary?
Dog.
Dude, that's gonna be hype.
Yo, I'm in the dictionary, dog. Hey. That's the one that they took? God damn it.
Freedom retirement.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, be in this dictionary, dog. Yeah. No, but that's a really good idea.
I want to go ahead and introduce you to the thing that I've been coming up with. It's combining, I was talking to our CEO about this. It's combining the one thing with an asynchronous call. So imagine like doing your to-do list, then prioritizing it, and then you do your number one thing. So like say it's build a schema for a website, and then I have to send it off to you for you to approve it. Now I have a blocker. So now I can move to the next thing. And then I can do that. Say it's record this podcast and send it to an audio engineer. And now that has a blocker. And I can move to my next thing. So it's taking a to-do list, prioritizing in terms of the one thing, and then executing one of those. And it's like an asynchronous call where something's pending, waiting on like information to get back from the server, which is essentially a blocker. And then you can move down your one thing. And then when you get that back, it re-triggers a new function.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I think I kind of operate in that way where I'm like kind of like work in terms of my own priority until it's blocked, move to the next thing, until it's blocked, move to the next thing, until it's blocked. Yeah, I think so. Although I'd want to dive deeper into that to see the way that you're really thinking about it. But in some capacity, I think I do that.
But that would be a new model.
Yeah, models are really cool. I always gravitated to abstract concepts and, just abstraction in general. Cause I really like the idea of being able to say, summarize something in a principle, right? Versus like, I guess I just, I gravitated towards math and just abstraction in general, as opposed to very specific details about like history and dates and people and stuff. I always, the only thing I ever found interesting about history is some kind of way to summarize everything that happened into in the frame of an abstract idea, like
very intuitive.
Yeah, as opposed to like just like a collection of information. I really gravitate towards information that's organized in some kind of way, or just completely abstract. And that's why I love that Naval podcast so much, is because it was 3 hours of just dense like abstraction. It was just like, right, he gave very few examples, only where necessary, and most of it was just like this philosophical, like these mantras of like, this is what you should do. So I started writing down some of my own personal and business mantras in kind of a web notebook, like a blog that I'm not releasing, I guess, which I could eventually release. But I really like am at a point where, right, I'm going through a lot of transformational kind of change in my thought process, and it helps to just formalize that right into a system or a way of thinking, a framework of thinking. And that's what we're kind of building too ourselves. We're kind of building our own, taking stuff like what Naval said or what the one thing is said, and combining things and building our own kind of foundation of thinking, which I think is what's really exciting for me.
Yep.
It's cool.
Yeah, it's cool. We're gonna be model and systems builders.
Yeah. Really cool, man. This is definitely really fun.
Yeah, it's fun as shit.
Yeah.
Well, cool. I don't think we need to pick what our next one's going to be right now. I think it'll be good for us to watch this and digest it and sort of, like you said, independently reflect on it, right?
Yeah, that was your thing. I think you got me onto that about like, let's avoid groupthink.
Yeah.
Let's right, because groupthink is like, I think before Dormy, I didn't even know what groupthink was necessarily, but it's really a strong thing, right? It's like whoever has the strongest opinion kind of just gravitates towards that, and right, try to avoid that at work and just in general. So it's like kind of leverage the benefits of two people working on a problem, or a group of people working on a problem at the same time in terms of brainstorming. But then in terms of, so when you're in I'm just thinking out loud right now, but when you're in a more of a brainstorming, or I don't know what the word is, kind of expansive point of thinking where you're trying to think outwardly and think of all the different possibilities, it's really nice to have other people to bounce ideas off of.
Exactly.
When you're trying to narrow it down to be critical and say what we need to cut out, what we need, what's wrong, what's the right way out of all these ways, that's good to avoid groupthink. That's good to process independently and then reconnect on.
This is making me think. I do want to have a system, I guess. I'm sending you a quick picture of this thing called Rumble language from Brene Brown. But this is just like at some point, because like, all right, so you and I are both very energized people who, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're both energized people who are smart and like we have conviction in our ideas. I think it would be a really good example for us to model for people on this podcast about when there's like a lack of alignment, or like we pretty much agreed on everything we talked about today, but at some point we'll hit something we have conflict over. And conflict's like this magical fucking thing where like new solutions, new systems, like new things can get birthed out of two people who don't have, it's like, okay, I have a perspective that I believe is true, and nobody's smart enough to come up with something that's 100% false, right? Like there's truth in both perspectives, but like, okay, we have some conflict, we don't agree. And then it's like, my truth isn't big enough to hold the space for your truth, and your truth isn't big enough to hold space for my truth, which means both truths are like true but partial and can be integrated into a more whole encompassing truth. And so we can model, it doesn't have to be a formalized system, but there can be specific things that we can model on the podcast when we hit friction points like that, to show that intelligent, smart, I almost want to say masculine energy can be mirrored with feminine energy, which is like very high curiosity, listening into, sensing into, like trying to like figure out what's trying to emerge here that we might not necessarily force, but sort of bubbles up out of the surface. And we can like model this, like, oh, let's get really excited about conflict. Like that, what a revolution that would be to change people's perspective on that.
I love conflict. I love conflict with certain people. It depends. Yeah. If with the right people, I really enjoy conflict, right?
It's like, and so one thing we could talk about I didn't do this with Dormy, but since Dormy, I learned like, every working relationship I have now, I say one of our core values is assuming positive intent. Because once we have that, it puts this infrastructure down that like, okay, if we're having a disagreement, it's not personal. And it's just nice to like have that tectonic plate in the infrastructure of the system that we're operating in, because it's never like me versus you. It's like, oh, we have these perspectives that aren't big enough yet, right? Like they're not able to hold the space for both truths. And so like if we can model on a podcast, like, okay, assume positive intent, like, and then we know that neither one of us could be wrong, like, and we also know that our truth is too small to hold the space for both truths. So how can we get really curious and excited about a new way that like integrates both truths into a more encompassing whole truth? And that like literally is the whole idea of this podcast. That's why it's so important for us to be able to model it, is because more and more perspectives are going to come in, and the true and partial perspectives are not going to be big enough to hold those perspectives. So we're going to have a model for breaking those down and building new ones.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, the collective wisdom of 30 people is certainly more, if organized and managed in the right way, is certainly more powerful than the wisdom of any one genius.
Exactly.
Especially when it comes to soft, you know, abstractions, and not necessarily like a one specific mathematical formula, but like, you know, principles of thinking and principles of, right, these kind of like abstract and not well defined problems that we're talking about. Certainly, I think the collective wisdom is stronger than the sum of its parts. But I think yeah, I think that's a really good way to go about it at work, because, you know, we're taking it for granted that we can disagree with each other and be 100% honest with each other when one person disagrees with the other, and that we're not going to take it personally because we have that relationship already built. But when you're, and you know, my mentality at work is always to just be as honest as possible without, you know, you can be nice about everything that you're saying, but you should always be really honest and really challenging in terms of when you disagree with something, even if someone's from the CEO all the way down to, right, like the analysts. Like, you, if you don't agree with what someone's saying, you should tell them in a nice way, and you should feel comfortable to be able to challenge it. Anyone should feel comfortable to challenge the ideas of anyone else. And if you don't have that open communication and open challenge, your organization's not going to succeed. I
Right.
think we're taking that for granted if we know that, but it might be worth talking about on this podcast as well, because there's certain things that I wouldn't even think to bring that up, because it's just like, I just make that as an assumption. But that's like, that I didn't actually always know that, you know, like I
Yeah.
didn't know that that's how I didn't, when I was younger, I didn't know that that's the optimal way to work in a business. So it's worth talking about.
Well, and it's so funny because this is such a flashback to when we did that feedback session with Dormy, and it was that challenge and support polarity. And you were like, Forrest, like, you were like so open and you will consider everybody's idea, but you don't like fucking, you're literally like, you don't lead. And like, this is almost like a check-in for me and how much I've evolved since then. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
almost have to give myself like a little pat on the back because I'm so able to like step up now and like say something, but not from a place like, I think before I was just afraid of like hurting somebody's feelings or making,
Right.
or it being personal, or like,
Right.
and I've just learned, like, I guess, you know, assuming positive intent and things like that, ways to fucking like not, to know that that's not personal. Like, hey, if
Yeah.
we're
It's
gonna
not
have a big,
personal. Yeah.
it's not personal. And like, and just saying it's not personal doesn't make it not personal, but having something like assuming positive intent can actually make it not personal.
Right. Yeah.
Like,
And it's like, yeah, there, you have an issue if someone is, you know, making personal attacks on people, but you know, I think it's more often the fact that what you're really challenging isn't the person, but you're challenging their ideas. And I think
right.
we take ownership of our ideas to the point where
Exactly.
we assume that they're our identity. Our ego tries to keep grabbing more and more and more, right? Like, this is me, and you know, your ego thinks that all of your ideas are it, but you know, I think that if you don't hold on to your ideas as heavily, then, you know, you don't get offended when someone challenges your idea, right?
Right. Right.
um I think that's important. Like,
Yeah. And
we are not our ideas. Like, our ideas are,
it's so fucking well said, man. My
yeah,
God. We're not our ideas. We don't own our ideas. And when we
yeah,
can have that detachment and that space we were talking about earlier, that space, that
yeah,
meditation between us and our ideas, then it's
yeah,
like, okay, like, here's an idea. And sometimes, dude, I'll be in a meeting and I'll be like, I'm thinking out loud right now. I'm going to say this. I don't even know if I agree with it. Like, and it's just
yeah.
like, let me get this idea out there,
Just
and
gonna
then we can like,
stir some shit up. Yeah, it's
right,
like,
like we can beat it up, we can smack it down. Sometimes I throw it
yeah,
up, take it right back. Like, it's just like, let's not have this attachment to our ideas. Like, we're just
yeah.
sort of like,
Don't have to wait until I've perfected an idea to bring it up. It's just, you know, because I'll do the same thing. So if I'm just like, actually, I don't know if this is right yet, but like, what if it was this, right? Then I might only be able to go to that level, but that might give someone else a stepping point to
yeah,
connect two dots that they had in their head, where they're like, oh, but what if it was this? And then, you know, it's
it's like,
sort of a brainstorming session. And then,
oh,
right, through everyone throwing out their intermediate ideas, you get to a good solution. But if everyone's waiting to like solve it themselves, you're not collaborating. You're just like being like, let me solve this problem and then show everyone that I'm smart by telling them that I figured it out. That's not the right way to go about it.
Isn't it amazing how much that mirrors software development? Like,
how so?
I mean, it's like you like, I built like, somebody builds a schema that gets passed along to someone who builds a query that gets passed along to someone who builds a fucking screen and then someone builds a button, and it's like getting iterated. It's an idea getting iterated upon, like, and however you want to just define iteration. Like, it's like,
yeah, I see that as more of like a hierarchy, like yeah, but yeah, it's similar idea, kind of like a hierarchy that's, you have a foundation that gets built up and built up and built up. Although
it's the same with ideas though, right? Because we kind of introduce an idea and then it can go from more broad to more specific, or more specific to.
Yeah.
I think it's actually a more question of scope than what I was just saying. Like, and that's maybe what I was hearing from you in terms of a hierarchy.
Yeah. 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 Hierarchy isn't quite the right word to describe what you're talking about with the queries into the, right. Those are different like steps in the process, but they're not necessarily one above the other in accumulating. They're kind of like just, right. Yeah. Interacting and kind of, kind of a chain. But yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, man, I got to run, but this has definitely been really cool.
Yeah, man, I had a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm gonna enjoy looking at this.
Let's touch base whenever you feel like it.
Sounds good, man.
Have fun tonight. Say what's up to Florsey for me.
You too. Will do, man.
All right, man. Peace.